All right. Well, we will continue the series here, looking at the different parables of Jesus. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 20 tonight, if you'd like to turn there. And this is going to be verses 1 to 16. And I've entitled this, The Laborers in the Vineyard. You might see in your Bibles, it might say Workers in the Vineyard, or the Parable of the Workers in the Vineyard. Was that a question? Yes. Yep, if you were one of the elect and were here, if you would have been here to help clean that one day. All right, so we're going to be Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. And as I said, this is the laborers in the vineyard. So let's just go ahead and read the text here. And it says this, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. He went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said to them, 'You also go to the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Again, he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing idle, and said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive.' So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, 'Call the laborers, and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first.' And when those came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more, and they likewise received each a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, 'These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them and said, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first last. For many are called, but few chosen." All right, so in this text here, just to give a little bit of a summary to the story. So we see that this is Jesus giving another parable, and we're in the section that's primarily focusing on realms of salvation. And though it does say at the very beginning that for the kingdom of heaven is like, and we've seen that in Matthew 13 a lot when he's introduced these parables, I just want to reinforce once again that all of these parables, you'll see different elements of these things. So it's not that saying that the kingdom is not relevant to this discussion, right? It's just to say that the primary focus that he's looking at is something to do with salvation. And then as we look at it then, we see then that there's this landowner, and that is what he's being compared to, the kingdom of heaven. This landowner who goes out and he decides he's going to go to the marketplace and he's going to find these laborers. And he calls these laborers to come and to work on his vineyard. And he starts early in the day. And then as these laborers are working in his vineyard, he'll go out and he comes at, it says the third hour, and he comes later, and he just does this multiple times all the way until, I believe it says it's the 11th hour, which would have been around 5 p.m. And this is just an hour before the end of the workday. And so basically he calls them to come and work in the field, in the vineyard. And then at the end of the day, when it says it's evening time, he says, "All right, I want all of my managers to come and pay everybody that has been here for the workday." And so he says, "I want the guys that came at the 11th hour, I want them to come first." And he gives them a denarius, right? Which is about a day's wage potentially. So what it would have cost for the full day's work, he gives these people that worked an hour basically 12 times what they worked. So then he gives it to them. And then all these guys that had been working all day, they're waiting back in the line and they're thinking, "Oh, wow. This landowner is giving them a lot of money for just the very little that they work. So now, because we did a lot, we're going to get a ton of money," right? So then finally it gets to the point where the people had worked at the very beginning of the day, they get their money, and all of a sudden they see that they also got a denarius. And so then they start to complain and they say, why is it that we're getting this? We have worked so much more. We bore the sun, the heat, the hard work. And then the landowner basically says to him, he says, why are you complaining? We agreed that you would work for a denarius. And then he says, is your eye being evil for me being good? And then basically that's referring to the fact that, are you being jealous because of my generosity? And then basically Jesus then uses this by summarizing the statement at the end of the parable by saying, so the last will be first and the first are last. And before we just go in too much detail here about what all these elements and symbols mean, I think it's important, just like most parables, almost all texts that you want to read, to go back to see what was happening right before Jesus went into this parable. Because a lot of times when you read the context or read what's happening right before it, you can see why he is teaching this lesson. So, if you'd like to go to just a little bit before chapter 20, this is Matthew 19, and I'm going to read verse 25 down to verse 30. So this goes right into chapter 20. Now, verse 25, it says, when his disciples heard it, they were greatly astonished, saying, who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said to them, with men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Then Peter answered and said to him, see, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? So Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. So basically what's happening here is Peter and the disciples had just seen Jesus turn away the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler was claiming about how he had followed the law perfectly and how he was saying, how can I inherit or be a part of the kingdom of heaven? Basically, he's asking, how can I be saved? Basically, because he's saying, I've worked and done all these things. And Jesus calls him to sacrifice all of these great things, his possessions, and to follow him. The rich young ruler doesn't do it. Then all of a sudden, the disciples are freaking out here. They're saying, who then can be saved? Right? And that's where you're seeing Peter's first statement there, where they're saying they're being greatly astonished. And then Jesus says, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. And then that's when it leads into Peter's question in verse 27. And he says, then Peter answered and said to him, see, we have left and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? So he talks about now the disciples have sacrificed and they've done things. They're serving and working for God. And now they're saying, what should we have? Or what will we have? And then that goes then into Jesus' long response. And then in verse 30, right before the parable actually starts, he says the same thing that he says at the very end of the parable. So in verse 30 of 19 and in verse 16 of 20, it says basically the same thing, only he flips it. The first one it says, but many who are first will be last, and the last first. And then in verse 16 it says, so the last will be first, and the first last. So when we look at this, we want to think about the context of what just happened, where Peter was asking Jesus these questions about what will they receive based on them sacrificing everything. And we see that Jesus does what is called an inclusio. He says something at the very beginning and at the very end to let you know that everything that's within the middle is its context, or it's summarizing what the whole primary point is. So as we look into that, then let's keep that in mind. So when we think about the parable then as a whole, we really have two primary focused characters. We have the landowner and we have the laborers. Now the landowner, I'm sure most of us probably can guess who it is. Anyone? Jesus, God, basically, yeah. So the landowner is God, the one who is able to give the blessings, is offer salvation, is able to call people, right? That's who the landowner is, this wealthy landowner. Now the laborers are disciples on different levels of spiritual maturity. And you're going to see that because each of these laborers, they come from different times, they're called at different places, but they are called to work. They're called to serve the landowner. So likewise, that is going to be disciples of different ranges, different spiritual levels of maturity. And then they're all being called to work in his vineyard. And now, for the vineyard, what the vineyard is going to represent basically is this. The vineyard is the disciples' opportunity to be within the kingdom and to do good works through acts of service and work for God. So when we think about these three as the symbols, I want to go into just a little bit more of explanation of some of the things that you're going to see in the text, and then we'll start to go through the parable and explain what exactly is Jesus teaching. So the other thing that I want to mention is the Jewish workday. So the Jewish workday, does anyone remember when the Jewish workday would typically begin? A little bit less. 6 a.m. And then it would go all the way till around 6 p.m. So it would be about a 12-hour full workday. And in the text, it says that this landowner goes out in the early morning. And then it says the very next, or the time that it finally gives a time device, it says the third hour, which was which was 9 a.m. So we see these different events. We see early in the morning, which was probably right around the beginning of the workday at 6 a.m. We see the third hour at 9 a.m. We see the 6th hour at 12 p.m. We see the 9th hour at 3 p.m. And then we see the 11th hour at 5 p.m., which, as I said, was probably just an hour before the end of the workday. And all of these different times, the landowner has continued to go out and call these different laborers at these different times. So each laborer is working less than the other. But then we notice at the very beginning of the text in, let's see here, in verse 2, what does the landowner agree with the laborer? Yeah, the salary, right? Yeah, and he says that he agrees with these individuals to give them a denarius, right? But did you notice that no other group agrees, right? No one else agrees to a certain wage. Does anyone notice what the phrase is that is used to describe how the landowner promises to pay the others? Yeah, to pay what is right? What is fair, what is just, right? Because this is what's going to be the driving question of what really Peter is asking, what the young rich ruler was asking, and then what's going to be the application for us is this. Is the way that God offers salvation and blessings, is he fair and is he just with how he chooses to bless us or to give things to us? And that's really going to be the question here. So we see then that God, or the landowner, is calling these different laborers at different times to come and to work for him. We see that he agreed then to call these certain individuals at the very beginning. He says, I'm going to give you a denarius. And as we saw earlier, as we were describing, you have this lineup basically at the end of the day. And could you just imagine being that person? I think there's probably people that have probably done something like this before, maybe been in a situation like this before. You've worked literally all day in the sun, out on a vineyard, manual labor, and you come to get your money, and you see these guys that literally just got here. They probably haven't even broke a sweat yet. They literally come, they basically say, hey, where's a shovel or where's a tool that I need? They go grab it, and basically the whistle's called and it's time to be done. And then they get to go in front of you now, and you're waiting in line to get your money, and you see they just got a denarius. That's what I agreed for, right? So then you get more and more excited as you're waiting in line, you're walking, you're just like, going like this, saying, I'm going to make so much money because they just made 12 times what they made. So imagine what I'm going to get. They get to it, and as we had already mentioned, they get really mad, right? They get furious with what the landowner, right? What the landowner gives. And then they basically start to, say that he is not being fair. He is not being just. And then his response, as we said or mentioned earlier, it's that he says a very kind rebuke, actually. We see certain parables where there's a very severe rebuke, but he calls him a friend in this. And he says, friend, I have done you no wrong. And this is really, as I said, this is the big question that we have to ask ourselves with God, with his generosity is God fair? And I think this is really pointing to the fact of what he's saying with the first will be last and the last will be first. God is flipping these positional statuses. What we view as just in our world, he is saying that the kingdom of heaven flips our expectations. What we view as just or fair is actually the opposite in a lot of the account here, because when we see Jesus describing fairness, it looks to us as unjust. And that's really what he is pointing at when it comes to the kingdom of heaven. He's saying, your expectations, you looking at this rich young ruler, you think because he has a lot of wealth, therefore he is better than a lot of other people. But I'm saying it's the opposite. Just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean that therefore you are more spiritually wealthy. And that's kind of what he's doing. He's flipping everything on its head. So, with that question then, is God fair? Is he just? And when we look at this parable and we're thinking, and I've already seen some people say it, I would have been mad, probably too, right? Here are some of the practical lessons that we take away from why and how we can know that God is fair. First is this: God does not owe us anything. Right? So think about these day laborers. If you know much about a day laborer, what they would do is these were people that didn't have a regular job. They didn't have a set salary. They didn't have any minimum wage to fall back on. They didn't have any of these government programs that they could rely on if they had unemployment, right? Literally, if you didn't get hired somewhere that day, you didn't get money. And if you didn't get money, you didn't eat. And that would mean that you can't provide for your family, you can't provide for yourself, and you could potentially starve and die. So these day laborers would go to the public marketplace, which would be a place where, rich landowners who own their own property could come, and they could basically hire and negotiate for whatever price that they wanted. So we then have this landowner then who comes up and he decides to offer a very good wage to these day workers. And that is how we view God to us. See, it's all of grace that calls any of us to work in his vineyard. See, none of us, we're all just like day workers, day laborers that we're just hanging out in the marketplace and we have nowhere to go. We don't have work to do. We don't have any money coming in, spiritual income, right? But then we have God, or we have this landowner who he comes and he offers you this very fair wage. He says, I'm going to give you a day's salary for your day's work. Very fair, right? And they agree to this. So that's what we're seeing is we think of God as someone who is giving us grace in which we don't deserve it. He doesn't owe us anything. God is not any man's debtor. And then we think about it when it comes to our salvation. That's what it's like. God offers each and every one of us salvation as a landowner. He's calling us to come, to be a disciple, to be a servant, to work in his vineyard, to work for his kingdom. And now when we think about our salvation, just like we think about that denarius, we should be very content with it. Because see, we can be tempted to think that we need more. But even if God doesn't give you anything else, any other blessings in this world, let's just say that you lose your job. Let's say that your family, your friends pass away. You're all by yourself. Even if all that God ever gave you was the gospel and you receiving it and being saved, that should be enough. Because that is greater than anything we would have ever been able to do on our own. And that's kind of what he's pointing to. He's saying God is super fair. He's super just in this. So we need to be content then what God has given us. And I just think it's interesting to think about any single thing in your life right now. When you think about your job, you think about your property, you think about your income, any of the materials that you have, your relationships, the marriage, the ability to come to church tonight in a comfy chair and to worship and to study God's word. These are all blessings. These are all things that God, the landowner, is giving and offering us that we didn't deserve. Every single thing is generosity and mercy. Every single thing. So whenever we ever want to complain about something we don't have, we have to remember everything that God has already given us. So that's the first thing that I want to draw out. But the second thing, yes, you have a question or a comment? Yeah, of course. Yeah, if you guys have anything as we're going, please feel free to make a comment or a question as we go.
I would say we probably have all been in a position, me and your mom's talked about it, we'd be pretty mad, if that happened. And I've always kind of looked at this and tried to reason this out in my own flesh and not spiritual eyes. But that he goes out and he hires, but yet he sees the project is so much bigger and needs more. And then even by the end of the day, if he didn't go out and get those last laborers before the sun set, there's no way the project gets finished. So he needs each one of them at different times, and you're right. They agreed to the salary. And so he didn't break his word at all. He just needed more laborers. So I kind of reasoned it that way, because it is difficult when we work in the real world and we get jobs and vocations and people get promoted and salaries are given out and so on and so forth. And I've been in different types of companies where they may pay on merit, which I like that better, instead of just everyone does the same job, same pay, same whatever. I'd rather get paid on merit or, like what I'm doing now, commission. So I do more work, I get more pay. So I kind of like that system for me. Some people don't work. They like security of hourly pay, go in, work, and so on and so forth. But, this has been a struggle. And I'll be very honest. In the past month, I've had a struggle at work because I built a lot of these accounts up, and now I have to give them away because I'm leaving the company, the next few years. And there's been somewhat promises to me, but I didn't take that on, because they were always my jobs, then I would glean some money, but that just hasn't went through it, and that part's okay. But I do work with some coworkers, and they take over all my accounts. So when I work with them, we're supposed to split the money, which is fair, 50-50. Well, our new boss, and this is fair because they can do what they want. I mean, my former boss, he sold it to his son. And his wife's very managerial and understands what's going on. So she said, well, that's not fair to take part of Matt's money and pay you. So he can keep his money and I'll pay you extra too by the hour. So she's paying a lot more labor costs. So it's really not necessary. But to me, I look at it like, wait a minute. I know how much he's making because those are all my accounts that he's gleaning off of. And it's a lot more than what I was getting. So I'm having to live in this for the past month of what you felt like you deserve, what you should have. And,
that's the
it's
point.
A good thing. I mean, it's a good thing to have to struggle in these real life situations.
Yeah, it's good to have that struggle because it points you to really wrestle with the text. But that's what the biggest point of this is, regardless of if he needed the laborers or not. The fact of what this parable is teaching is it doesn't matter because it's the landowners. The landowner owns all of this property, and he's saying, this is all of mine, so it is all of grace by my choice to choose to offer it or not to offer it to those who I would like to. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. One thing that hit me with the laborers that came along later in the day, you see, one, they're willing. They're standing out there just waiting for somebody tell them what to do. They're willing, but they're also, they exercise that measure of faith. He says, I'll pay you what's right. And they had faith that he would. And so I think that's, also opens the door for God's grace to be exercised. He's looking for that just blind faith, and that he's going to take care of us. So. Oh
yeah, absolutely. And I think that you see that the difference between the attitudes or the personalities of the laborers from those from the beginning, and how they were making a contract where those who others were just thankful. They were just thankful that they were getting any work at all. Yeah. You have a microphone there?
I don't know if I'm getting ahead of you or not, but to me, the ones that had the contract were representing Israel. And the ones without a contract are representing the Gentiles. And so he's got a contract with Israel, but now he's opening his grace and his salvation to everyone that accepts. And even though we didn't have the original contract, we didn't have the agreement with him, we're still just as much his children as the original contract with Israel.
Yeah, and there are some that I know that some of the commentators I've read do take that. I don't have a personal stance one way or the other on that, whether or not it is or not, but I have read that there are some that think that because there's this emphasized agreement of a wage or this, and so they view themselves like some of the Pharisees did. They viewed, look at all this stuff that God has called us to do and all these things that we have done. We have been so faithful and we've done all these things, and now you're calling all these people to do all this stuff and you're still giving them the benefits that are supposed to be of Israel. So I completely understand that view, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not necessarily against it, but I'm not fully sure where I'm at on that specifically, if they represent a specific people group or just
Rana's
people.
Ryrie Study Bible, that's exactly what he says. He says it's Israel and Gentiles. However, doesn't make a bit of difference on what you're saying. It's the exact same parable, exact same story. It's just, are we talking about disciples on different planes with God? Well, what would you call the Jews? Same.
Yeah. Well, and also a lot of his disciples would have been Jews as well.
It doesn't change the parable one way or the other, words, whether it's Israel and Gentiles or whether it's disciples on different levels of spiritual, on a spiritual walk or not. The vineyard, it's the exact same parable.
Yeah.
Ron, as I just read hers too, and he thinks because it says they had the agreement. The first ones had the agreement. He compares that to a covenant, the promises given to Israel, but it doesn't change. It doesn't change the parable one way or the other.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to go too far down this rabbit trail. The only thing that I would point out that could potentially be an issue with it would be if you take the denarius as the blessings of God, or potentially salvation as the entrance of the reward of the kingdom. If you were to take it as that way, you wouldn't want to say those who were anti-Christ, not an anti-Christ, but to be anti against what Jesus was teaching and preaching. You wouldn't want to say that those Pharisees who were rejecting Christ to be those who were receiving that reward. Like I said, I haven't fully gone down that route to say one way or the other, but that would be one potential view.
This is one of those that you can believe either way, and it really doesn't change the parable.
Yeah.
Just kind of looking at this a little bit different, because I've sat in the laborers' hall. I was a union, a labor union, and I've sat in the laborers' hall. I know when you're sitting there, you show up early, and you're sitting there. You're waiting for the bosses to come in and say how many people, or for the call to come in to say how many people are needed. So when they do say how many people are needed, when you're chosen, you breathe a sigh of relief. So all of a sudden, we have this, the Bible says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. So now we look at these guys going out, and they're happy. I mean, I'm happy. I've got a job today, and maybe a week, or maybe a month, or maybe for the whole summer, because I did it when I was going to college. So we would be, so I look at that guy as a young person that accepts Jesus Christ. So that young person that accepts Jesus Christ, he's got this peace that passes all understanding his whole life. The laborers that go out early So I understand when they look at people in this parable, they look at people and they say, well, you've only been working for the Lord for 1 year. I've been out since I was 9 years old working for the Lord, and how come you're getting the just reward that I'm getting, salvation and heaven, glory? On the other hand, we look at that as Christian people, and I think if we look at the landowner, God, being the person that God is, knowing what he says to the people, why are you mad? Because I'm good? Is that what making you mad? Because I'm good, I'm doing, I think that when we see somebody older come to the Lord, do we not rejoice? I mean, I do. I see somebody that I think is lost, and I rejoice. Especially if it's an old person, and I go, wow, all this year he could have had this peace that passes all understanding, and he just now is receiving that. So when God explains things, it's not here, but I can see him going farther than just saying, because I'm good, you're mad. I can see him saying, but think about it. When I came to you, you guys knew you were working all day, that you guys have had the peace knowing that you're feeding your family, you're taking care of things. They have had to sit in that hall or sit wherever they for 9 hours. 10 hours, not knowing if they were going to do anything. Think of you guys had at least peace all this day. Yeah. They haven't. I don't know if that made sense to you.
No, that does. And I'll get to that point. And I know there's a comment. We're going to move down. If it's relevant, we're going to continue because I have to make it for time. So the next thing that I want to point out is that blessings are not based upon our own work, but upon God's goodness and his grace. So as we had already mentioned, entrance into the kingdom is of grace, but not our merit, right? So whenever we look at these different laborers who have worked at different amounts of time and that they have come to this line at the end and they're trying to use their merit, what they've worked, the time that they've been there, and they say, therefore, I should be getting all of this. And we need to recognize that whenever we are working, when we are laboring, we are not doing it in such a way that we are saying that we think that then God is going to bless us then this much, right? We cannot use our merit as a way to say, God, now you owe me this, right? We need to understand that God can bless whoever, whenever, and however he wants. And I think maybe a couple of you guys have mentioned this before. You can get caught up with starting to compare yourself to these other laborers. And you might think to yourself, well, I feel like this person doesn't have an education on maybe pastoral ministry. And they have a church that has 1,000 people. But our church has multiple trained ministers. Or we have one of the greatest, fill in the blanks for this church. But for some reason, God is blessing another church with greater numbers. Or you could use this for so many things. You could say, I've worked harder than a lot of these people that I know. But for some reason, they keep getting better jobs, better opportunities. See, we can get so caught up with thinking, because I did all of this, therefore God owes me this, this, and this. Well, we have to remember, when it comes to the kingdom of God, when it comes to these spiritual blessings, when it comes to the blessings God gives us, it's not based on your merit. It's not based on how hard you work or how good you are. At the end of the day, it's all of grace. Any blessing God gives, he is free to bestow it on whoever he wants, however he wants. So we want to make sure then that we don't then get frustrated with those who we're working with. We don't get frustrated with the landowner. Because when I think we look at the landowner, what was the landowner's priority? Was it profit or was it people? Right, yeah, that's God's ultimate, right? He is not very, what's the word I'm looking for? He's not conservative with giving out these denarius or denarii, right? He's saying, I'm going to keep going, I'm going to keep calling people, even though I know that these last hour workers are probably not going to give me very much production, I'm still going to give them everything I gave to everybody else. See, that's what God's like. He is not worried about the profit near as much as he is about people. Just like the landowner, he's concerned about giving us the ability to work, to be a part of the kingdom, to be a part of that vineyard. That's what he's doing. He's continuing to graft people, call people in, and that's how our focus then should be. not focused on what are we getting out of it, how much money did we make, how many members are in our church, how much God is blessing us, right? Our focus should be on the fact that God called us, and we have the honor now to serve and to work, which leads to that final point, which is that disciples should work for the Lord with joy and gratitude. See, wherever you're at now, so if you're at the early morning, the 6 a.m. worker, and you have the blessings as Uncle Jim mentioned earlier, if you're that person that has that peace because God called you very early in life, you have the ability then to do all these great things for God. But it's not so you can tell him, now you owe me all this. It's to enjoy all of this time and all this peace that comes with knowing I have somewhere to work. I get to use my talents, and I have that comfort knowing that I'm assured and I am, what's the word I'm looking for? Content in being with Christ and what he has promised me, because we have made this agreement and I know that he is going to be just in what he offers us. But then we also, when we think about these different workers, we want to make sure that we continue to work humbly and not begrudgingly. We can get caught up with working for God, working for the kingdom, and starting to get frustrated, right, as we continue to work and we try to build up this production. But we remember that if you continue to become ungrateful for what God has given you, then that can lead to your resentment of the landowner. So think about that. Us working for God, if it's not done with a spirit of joy and a spirit of gratitude, it can actually lead to resentment of God. So we want to make sure then when we do serve God, as we are walking with God in our lives, whatever hour of the day God called you, right? Wherever God's called you in your life, you are called to get up, to serve now, to serve with joy, and to be excited no matter where God is calling you. Because once again, it's all of grace, right? There are many people who are not working, who don't have the job, that are sitting in the marketplace, that are idle by, right? So we want to make sure that we continue to rejoice at any opportunity God has given us to work and enjoy it all through our lives and not compare ourselves, because there are going to be people that come on their deathbed with deathbed conversions. The thief on the cross is a wonderful example of that. Yeah, how he literally hadn't done almost anything for the kingdom of heaven. But he's literally on the cross next to Jesus. And now Jesus probably gave him some wonderful blessings, right? He didn't work for them. He didn't earn them with all of these great times of service. He was an 11th hour worker. He literally says, remember me in your kingdom. And he says, I tell you this day, you will be with me today in paradise. He's saying, you haven't done anything, but guess what? I'm going to give you paradise. Think about that. So that's why, once again, it's not merit. Everything is of grace. And so we need to serve with that righteous, that spirit of joy and gratitude as we serve the Lord, because no matter where we're at, God is going to handle it justly, because those people he made the agreement with, he didn't break his commitment. He was just. But we also are going to know that God, he's going to be generous and gracious at times. For those people who didn't work near as hard as some, they are still going to get these great rewards. And I think that's what he's wanting to remind Peter and the disciples of, is that he says, you guys are going to be working very, very hard. You guys are doing a lot, and there's going to be just rewards. God is going to be gracious and generous with you. But there are going to be some people that come later that might not do everything that you have done. And I am gracious and I'm going to be generous with them. And I don't want you to ever compare yourself and think I am being somehow unfair by blessing these people who might not do what you do. And we should do the same for those brothers and sisters that come to Christ wherever they're at. Yeah. Can we get the microphone over there?
Last week on the prodigal son, that's where the older brother, that it's the same parable. The older brother, he's mad. He gets upset.
Yep.
But he forgets. All of this time, my brother's been eating the pods with the swine. I've been having great food in a great house with a great father. And he forgets about that. But when the father offers the prodigal the same thing that he had for the entire time the prodigal was away. It's a very similar parable, I think.
I think that's such a great reminder. Is just Think about these things. We can get so caught up with comparing ourselves to the blessings that God has given us, and we neglect all the wonderful blessings that he is already doing in our lives right now. And as I said, even if he didn't give us anything, but the thing is, God is so gracious and generous, we've all gotten more than we even deserve, right? We're all really the 11th hour worker, aren't we? Even though that there's this, the end of the day, end of our lives concept, but really, God has given us way more than any of us could ever ask for or earn or deserve or merit when he gave us the gospel and he gave us salvation. And now everything else with family, friends, all these jobs, these blessings in this life, that's all overflow that God is giving us. So we need to take every day as grace, every day as mercy, every day as love that this landowner that God gives us as we continue to work in his vineyard. Did you have anything?
That it all comes down to that old parable where the man says, I was mad because I had no shoes till I met a man who had no feet.
Yeah.
And that's where.
Yeah, good. Did you have something? Yeah. This will be the last comment, and then we're going to close for prayer.
The whole point comes down to grace, like you say, and no matter what we earn, no matter what we receive, no matter what blessing we have, when it's all said and done, we lay it at the foot of the cross. Everything we gain here, we offer it right back at the end and say, thank you, Lord.
Yeah.
So
that's such a great way to think and end it, is everything that we serve, everything that we're working, every reward we get, we're doing it so we can come back and give it back to the Lord. So we use all these gifts, all these opportunities to just give it back to the Lord and say, this is what I've done with what you've given me. So, and have that peace doing it and that joy to do it. Amen. Yes. All right. Well, that will conclude our time of study.